We're going to go over the quiz over parabolas. So if you have your sheet, go ahead, get that out, and follow along. And if I were you, I would kind of take notes on the ones that I missed. Maybe do those corrections if you haven't already done those while we're going through this. Please review this as many times as you need to understand the questions. Also, if you have any questions remaining after it's all done and said, go ahead and email me, and I'll be happy to maybe take this a little bit further. The first question is a circle, and it just says write the equation of a circle. So this is essentially completing the square. So we're going to go ahead and set that up, and we're going to go ahead and get our x's and our y's grouped together. The constant value is on the far side, in this case on the right side. And so once we do this, we're going to do b over 2 squared, a pretty traditional thing that we've kind of always been doing. But at this point, I want to make sure that you note that on this side here, I have added the same exact values that I did here. So whatever happened here, so if I added 9 there, and I added 64, I do the same, plus 9 and plus 64. It's not an opposite thing. A lot of common mistakes where whatever you did on this side, you do the opposite over here. That is not true. Whatever you do to one side of an equation, you must do the same exact thing to the other side, right? And then we're going to rewrite the expression, and essentially we're done. I wanted to call your attention to the part right before I square it, and that was negative 3 squared. There's where negative 3 goes. This one was negative 8 right before I squared it, so that became negative 8 or y minus 8 here. That's always a good thing to check for, to make sure you're looking at it. Now, if I wanted to go ahead and just kind of analyze this, I know that my center is going to be 3, 8, and my radius would be 8. A number of people didn't know if they should square the 64 or square root the 64 or whatever, but when you're solving an equation, notice I didn't do anything to change. I didn't change anything. I just let the problem work itself out. What I have at the end is my equation for my circle. Don't do anything extra. It's when I give you the equation and I ask you to graph it, then you're going to have to do a couple of things to find the center and the radius, just like I showed you at the bottom here. Change the signs and then square root the r, or r squared. Let's move on to number 2. Number 2 and number 3 are a lot like number 1, except in this case they're for parabolas instead of circles. So the process remains exactly the same, except we're only going to be completing the square for one of the variables and not both. So we'll set this one up, and we're going to group our x's together and the rest of the terms on the other side, because the x is squared. That's the one I'm going to complete the square with. So I've got this grouped together. So my part that I'm going to complete the square is here, and then the y value and the constant stay here. I'm going to go ahead and do b over 2 squared, kind of plug that in and add that to both sides. Here, a big mistake here is a lot of you forgot to do this part right here. They didn't add the 9, so things kind of got messy after that. At that point, I factored this side, x minus 3 squared, and then I left the other side the same, except I combined the 11 and the 9. But now I need that y to be a coefficient of 1, so I'm going to factor out the negative 4. And that's going to change the sign of the second term, so watch as we do that. And as I make sure to write that out, I make sure that if I were to multiply back, say from here negative 4 times y and negative 4 times negative 5, I want to make sure that I get the exact same thing I started with at the top. That lets me know that I factored that correctly. And now we can see my vertex is 3 and 5. Now to find p, I know the problem didn't ask you to do those two things, but just for practice, to find p, I take the value in front of the part that's not squared, and I set this thing equal to 4p. This was a big source of a big issue on the test, or on the quiz. 4p equals negative 4, and then I just solve for p. In this case, I'm going to divide by 4 on both sides, and I'm going to end up with negative 1 at the end. So if I were to go in to graph this, then p would be negative 1. We're going to do that a number of times in the problems to come. Just make sure that you have that down. I saw that was one of the big issues, is knowing how to write out p, or how to write out that number that goes in front of the equation, things like that. Number 3. This one was a lot like number 2. We had the difference here is that I've got a number in front of my squared term, so I'm going to have to factor something out. So let me go ahead and set that up. I went ahead and moved all of the y part, since the y squared was negative. I went ahead and moved that to the other side over here, so that worked out great. I'm going to complete the square by factoring out the 4 first, so we see that, And now I'm going to look at this number. This is my b. In this case, it's going to be negative 8. I'll go ahead and do b over 2 squared. I'll make sure to add that to both sides of the equation, but before I add it to the other side, I want to make sure that I multiply that 16 times the 4, because I've got that factored out, so I'm going to have to multiply 16 times 4 before I can get it to go to the other side, and that'll end up looking like this. If I combine all my like terms, I'll be essentially finished, and divided by 4 at the end because we want to get that number on the other side so we can have that ready to go. Number 4. Number 4 is different. It helps to be able to graph this. And so I'm going to go ahead and put this down on a graph just to kind of get a visualization of what it is I'm looking at. Now I've kind of magnified my distances a little bit to make this a little more obvious. So you see that the green dot is at negative 1/8, 0. The red dot, the vertex, is at 0, 0. And you can see here the distance from that vertex to this dot is p. I also know that this graph is opening to the left. That means my p is going to be negative in this case, right? So p, the distance is 1/8, definitely. But the sign, and we'll see in a minute, is going to be negative. So I'm going to go ahead, this is the equation we're going to be using up here. We're going to go ahead and plug that in. Notice that it opens left. I'll make sure to keep that negative sign there. And then I just collect everything and simplify. So 4 times negative 1/8 is negative 1/2. I do not need to keep those zeros involved, although if you do keep them there, that's not incorrect. You're allowed to do that. And that's number 4. Number 5 is like that. So we have the vertex and the focus. This time the vertex isn't at the origin, so we go ahead and I just went ahead and graphed this. Went ahead and put my vertex down. I know that my focus, you see this is at negative 1, but this one's at negative 1.5. So I'm just 1/2 below that value. So automatically I can look at this picture and tell you that P is going to be negative 1/2 because it's headed down and the distance is just 1/2. So we can show you there. So that's what it would end up being. If we go ahead and plug this into the equation and simplify, we'll get our final results. And always, at any point, if you have this kind of situation, go ahead and multiply that together. I do want you to do that. But my final result ends up being negative 2 times y plus 1 equals x minus 3 squared. Next equation, or the next problem, is 6. This one we started getting into the directrix. This is a lot like the other ones, except you have a directrix, and you have to remember that the graph opens away from that directrix. So I went ahead and put it on the page, and it definitely helps to know what the decimal approximation is. Since the vertex is at negative 6,8, these are going by 2s, that means that the directrix is just 1/4 away from that over here at negative 6.25. If we go ahead and kind of illustrate that, you can see the directrix there with the parabola opening to its right. Now I don't need the focus, I just need P and I need the vertex. And here this allows me to do that. Since it's opening to the right, I know that P is positive. I know that Y is going to be squared also. So let's pull up that equation and plug in our numbers. Once I do that, I have my equation done at the end. Number 7. Here we have the focus and the directrix. This one seemed to give people more problems. I'm not sure if it's the fractions or if it's having to deal with the focus and the directrix not having the vertex at all. So let's just look at that. All right? We can estimate the fractions as 1 7/8 and 2 1/8. And so that tells me that, well, halfway between 1 7/8 and 2 1/8 is 2. 2 is 1/8 away from each of those points. So just by thinking about it, I know that my vertex is going to be at that value. And you can see it here. So you've got halfway between these 2 points, you have, this is 1/8, or 2 1/8, and then 1 7/8. So halfway in the middle of that would be just 2. And so that's where my vertex falls, at 6, 2. Go ahead and plug that in. I know that tells me that the P is going to be negative, and it's going to be 1/2. And I'll plug that in, or 1/8, excuse me. Plug all that in, simplify, and I have my equation. The next question is going to be number 15. Let me back this up a little bit. You start out with just an equation. So this is essentially for a parabola. And we first need to organize that and put it into the right format. So you see that, go ahead, it's really already set up to complete the square. We'll go ahead and complete that square, b over 2 squared. You see that all happened here. We add 1 to both sides because b squared over 2, or b over 2 squared is 1. Go ahead, collect your like terms and factor. And you can see that happening here. So essentially we have our equation set up. Now I need to graph it, I need to label all the parts. So we need to find out what the vertex is and what P is in order to write everything out. So to find P, we do what we did earlier. You say 4P equals the number out in front of the non-squared side. So you can see that right there. It's not written, but it's implied. There's a 1, so you say 4P equals 1. Divide by 4, and you're going to get P equals 1/4. Okay, we'll go ahead and graph those elements, and we can tell you that it would look like this. We know that it opens up because it's x squared. P is positive. So you can see that happening here. We put the vertex down. We open the graph up. We know that whatever P is inside the parabola is going to be my focus, and the directrix is going to be just behind that. Okay, so we go ahead and add those two values, and that gives us the ability to write down the actual coordinate parts of each one. So just to kind of go in detail on that, what I did was I took the vertex, right, that's -1, 1. I know that I'm going to be going up to get the focus, and I'm going to be going back down to get the directrix here. So to go up, I know that I'm on the -1 x value, so the focus x coordinate is -1. If I add 1/4 to wherever I am here on the y-axis, 1/4 up would be 1 and a fourth, or you could say 5/4 or 1.25, however you want to think about that, and that'll give you the coordinate for the focus right there. If I go backwards, so 1 minus 1/4 would be 3/4 or 0.75, however you want to think about it, but that's at the y. Since it's a horizontal line, we're going to write that y equals, so you can see that over here. Axis of symmetry, that's what is going to cut your graph in half. You can see that cutting it in half here. And so we go ahead and say, what x value is that? Well, it's the same x value as the vertex. That's something to know. Every axis of symmetry is either going to be x equals the x coordinate of the vertex. You can see that here. Or if it's vertical, then it's going to be y equals the y coordinate of the vertex every single time. And you can see that we just wrote it here. So this essentially is all of the questions from the quiz. Rewatch this as you need. If you have a question on a particular one, please take the time and type it up in an email, send it to me. If you have any other questions on any of the worksheets we did, please remember to take a picture of the problem you're working on and send it to me, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can.